All right. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, or good morning to everyone or anyone who's listening to this. Whether you're here or you catch it on a few days later, we have another session, part two of our parent engagement with MLK. And today we're going to be discussing the political climate and just giving some education on what is going on, especially with this new candidacy. I felt like there would be no one better to speak about it than Mr. LaQuintes Brown. So he's going to be our guest speaker for today. Everybody give him a round of applause, and I'll let him take the role.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it, Trey. Thank you all for having me. Good evening. Let me share my screen. So, today I will be talking about the political climate and its impact on education. Just really want to give an overview of what's going on in politics today, and especially how it's going to affect educators, students, administration, and everyone kind of day to day with some of these new policies and the new agendas and positions that come from this second iteration of the Trump administration. So first, I'll give you just the agenda. We'll start with an introduction, just to let you all know who I am, why Trey recommended me, and kind of some of my background expertise. Then we'll talk about Trump's approach during his second administration. This administration is a bit different than his first administration, especially more aggressive in some of their policies and positions. So we'll just go through and give an overview of that. We'll talk about the most impactful policy since inauguration because he's only been in office for almost 2 months now. There's been a lot of change, but there's also a lot of change that we kind of have to wait and see develop. So I'm going to talk about the most impactful ones that everyone's kind of been anticipating, but also anticipating the most change from. Then we'll go from the actions against the Department of Education, how that impacts the school choice voucher system, the elimination of critical race theory. We'll give a brief talk about the tariffs and its impact on education because that is a hot topic and it does actually will have an impact on schools, local localities, and state governments that will trickle down to individual public schools. And then we'll also discuss Connecticut's stance on immigration. And throughout this, I'll kind of always bring it back to Connecticut, how Connecticut is handling it, because a lot of his administration's policies plan to give more power to the state and local levels and remove some of the federal intervention. How the state handles it is actually very important. So I'll touch on that. And then just how to be proactive. I don't want to be doom and gloom throughout all this. A lot of these changes, unfortunately, to the average American are negative. But I want to just give an idea of some solutions, just some ways to stay informed, and some ways to approach it. And then we'll have some time for questions. And also, if anyone happens to have a question in between a slide or anything, feel free to interrupt and we can address it. So, just to get started, introduction. My name is LaQuintes Brown. I received my Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from UConn. My original goal was to become an attorney, but during my final year at UConn, my senior year, Please try again. Siri felt the need to interject. So, during my final year at UConn, I really started the political science program has courses catered to how what you need to take in order to fulfill your major requirements, and some of those courses began to become film courses, media courses, and just addressing, evaluating, and kind of analyzing the propaganda in media, where it comes from, film's impact on it, TV's impact on it, and how perceptions are kind of created in the media that then affect our politics and legislation. And that really kind of inspired me to get more into the media and more into the arts. So initially, I was a political canvasser from my junior year into my post grad year of 2015, and I was political canvassing for Canvas for America and for nonprofits, basically just going around talking to different communities. One project I worked on, we were working on saving a lake in the Yukon area in Winstead. So we went around kind of garnering support, seeing if we could get donations, signatures, and that's really the grassroots start kind of entry level position for most people in the political industry. You really start with making those connections with your community. And from there, as I became more interested in film, I transitioned that into working at Charter Communications, filming community events. I worked for CPTV. I interned there, training students on. They had an interview with Dr. James Joseph, who was the first ambassador from America to South Africa, and I had to train them to prepare to do a live interview with him. So, and at that time too, I was at CPTV, an affiliate for PBS. I filmed Youth Concussions, which was about ongoing legislation in Connecticut to tackle youth concussions and better regulate youth sports so kids wouldn't receive those concussions. And so I just kind of really used that time to transition some of my political expertise into the media that I kind of became more inspired by, and all the while still volunteering and canvassing for campaigns and providing consultations. I had a friend who actually ran for a council member seat in Waterbury, and so I provided some conferencing and consultation for him just to kind of help him in his path and help his campaign. And that's also what I meant to mention. I'm from Waterbury, Connecticut, but I'm now based in Atlanta, so I still keep those that activism, whether it's in Waterbury, whether it's in Atlanta. I still try to maintain my connections to the community and use film and art as a way to address and speak to political issues. So first, we're going to talk about just a broad overview of Trump's approach during his second administration. So in his second administration, he's really become more aggressive with the use of executive orders. There's been an increase in them, where essentially an executive order is an order or a bill presented from the president. A lot of times in American politics, most legislation or bills or policies are presented from Congress, and they have to be passed through the House and Senate, and the president would then sign it into law on a federal level. But Trump and his administration in this second iteration of it, he has used executive orders where, as president, he draws up these bills, he signs them into law, and then they have to go then through the excessive legal challenges to see whether those are upheld or banned or barred by federal judges. So as we can see, he's been passing a lot of laws and changes. I'm going to go through some of those, but keep in mind as well, there's several federal judges on the state level and the federal level who stop these orders. So, for example, there was recently he you hear a lot about Trump attempting to dismantle the Department of Education, but then there were federal judges who said that's not actually something you could do without congressional support. So we now see him adjusting to dismantling the Department of Education, and we're going to go through what that looks like with dismantling it versus his original plan to abolish it looks like. And a lot of some of these bills, unfortunately, are passing with bipartisan support, the ones that aren't being barred. And I just wanted to highlight that because at the end, when I give you kind of some of the actionable steps we could take as everyday citizens, evaluating and holding our local government and politicians and elected officials responsible is an important aspect of providing checks and balances to Trump as well as the judges. And what he's really been using is pressure to pass these bills is federal funding as an incentive. So essentially, if you don't pass these bills, federal funding could be removed from your school, your locality, your state, whatever it may be. He's just kind of reaching for any way to enforce the bills he wants to subvert the actual political process in terms of how bills should be passed and enforced. Um, and so the most impactful policies that have taken place since inauguration is his dismantling of the Department of Education, enforcing stricter immigration policies and laws, and the imposition of tariffs. Again, I'll kind of go more into detail on what these look like, and these all do. You will see an effect on them on the local level and on the student and at school level. So the actions against the Department of Education. So right now, he's attempting to diminish the department again since he couldn't abolish it as he campaigned on, due to it being illegal without congressional support. Most federal judges would bar that, and he got excessive challenges from various senators and government officials. He then adjusted to just avoid the legal fights to dismantling it, which is still somewhat under the presidential purview. So what that looks like is they've eliminated almost 50% of Department of Education jobs. So the members, employees of the Department of Education are either laid off, forced to retire, placed in a forced layoffs where, hey, you either accept this voluntary layoff and get some form of stipend, or you don't accept this layoff and you're fired, you will receive no more money. There will be no stipend or way to kind of bridge you to your unemployment. And a lot of people, just to kind of avoid the issues, the pressure, they've went into retirement or relocated to another position of education. And most of those roles we saw impacted were in the student aid office or the office for civil rights. Those are two separate offices, but about 2,183 people have been laid off from the various offices. Those are just the most, those are the ones who have been most impacted. And the speculation obviously is when you get rid of people who work in the federal student aid office, it impacts who gets aid, how much aid is given. It also impacts for this Office of Civil Rights, it impacts how the student's treatment at school. You know, if a student has an issue with maybe how they were treated at school, or they believe they may not have been given the proper funds due to discrimination, whether it's, you know, to a special need they have, maybe it's a religious discrimination, a racial discrimination, gender, whatever it may be. That office is now impacted, so there's less people to cover these cases, to evaluate and investigate them, and to pursue justice for the people who are, you know, beginning these legal actions against whether it's their school or the Department of Education itself. And the potential effects, if the Department of Education is eliminated, are the reduction of resources for schools. We'll see this regardless of whether it's eliminated or not, unfortunately, because again, these roles are reduced. It is going to naturally affect how you can allot and who's responsible for allotting these resources. So the federal government assist the state and local levels in funding schools. So schools are typically, for a public school, you're going to be funded by your locality, whether it's a city, town, or municipality. You're going to receive funding from state, and then you'll receive on average 13.6% of funding from the federal level. That again, because it's an average, it varies per state. For Connecticut, that's about 8.2% in federal funding. So with the reduction of the Department of Education, that 8.2% is now in jeopardy. Now, 8.2% doesn't sound like an awful lot, but that's actually 1.1 billion or $2,133 per student each year. So that would now be a gap that would have to be filled by Connecticut as a state or whichever given city, town, or municipality, as we mentioned. So there's been, because those roles are reduced again, the Department of Education isn't only responsible for dispersing resources and funds, they're also active in collecting and protecting student information. They collect the information so that if there is an issue in terms of discrimination, they're able to have the data to back up which issue they may perceive is, or which issue they're investigating. And also they protect student data. So student data is a lot like HIPAA, like medical data, where you have to go through certain steps and processes to get information about a student from a school. With those positions affected, the collection of that data for purposes of monitoring who's receiving what resources and why will be affected, who needs what resources and why, and also it creates an ability and exposes people to have their data collected illegally or fraudulently. And so again, the reduction of the Department of Education also affects the elimination of school programs. It's a shift in care for minority population. So some of the positions and the demographics that everyone speculates to be most impacted are low income students, special education students. How will they be impacted? There would be a reduction in counselors, paraprofessionals, programs for mental health, and so on and so forth. Reduced lunch will be affected. Those are all programs that low income students and special education students tend to need more. And so they'll be impacted by this reduction. And these are just some graphs to kind of put it in perspective in terms of per student spending for Hartford. As of the most recent data is for 2022 and 2023's academic year. And Hartford per student on average spent $22,167. Now where that 22,000 goes is then broken down in the graph below. So 78.9% goes to low income students, 23.9% goes to multilingual learners, 20.3% goes to students with disabilities, and 93% of those populations are BIPOC students. So again, these are students who will be affected. The graph also illustrates just in some of Connecticut's other major cities what that will look like, and then West Hartford as a suburb, kind of how their money is dispersed. So again, the impact of this reduction looks different for each district, school, locality, and to kind of reinforce the school aspect. These are some of Hartford's public schools. And this just goes to show how much is actually being spent per student at these schools. So again, as that 8.2% looks different for each school, each district, each town. So that 1.1 billion gap will need to be made up in some form or fashion for each school. So again, one of the reasons there's been a reduction in the Department of Education is the opportunity to push forward a school choice voucher system. That's been something that it began in 1991 in Wisconsin and Milwaukee, but it's been gaining a lot of momentum recently in the last 10 to 20 years or so, specifically from Republicans. And this is a system where it uses public funds to allow parents to choose a private school for their children. They would be issued a voucher provided by the state that would cover tuition costs. So again, that per student figure would be allocated to a voucher, and you would be able to take that voucher and bring it to a private school in order to attempt to give your child a better education. Unfortunately, that has effects on public education and the students themselves. So Connecticut practices a form of open choice. It's not an actual voucher system, but it allows students to go to choose between magnet, charter, or public schools in nearby towns. Where the voucher system becomes problematic, and again, it was issued through a January 29th executive order. But the voucher system, first, it's had a lot of mixed reviews. Most of it hasn't been successful. So it's resulted in a 4% decrease in students in public schools. So students first, it reduces the amount of students in public schools, which reduces how much money those public schools have to now spend. Now, public schools have some costs that no matter the amount of students, they're not significantly affected. So if there's a reduction in students, salaries, like costs like lighting costs and costs to operate the school don't automatically decrease. So that gap still exists. The public schools still need that money that is now missing from each given student that decides to leave. And also, there have been studies showing that whether it be Arizona, Louisiana, Florida, Illinois, those are some of the states who have large voucher systems in place. They've experienced failure in their students, and they've seen students' academic levels decrease, and even those students whose test scores have decreased who went back into the public school system, whether it was a year, 2 years from them exiting the public school system, they then saw a rise in their scores. So just because they're leaving these public schools and going to private schools, it doesn't automatically mean it's equating to success for the student, whether that's through social and environmental changes, whether it's through some of these private schools now becoming overpopulated and not having the advantages, especially in a student teacher ratio that they had prior to the voucher system, that's affecting everyone's education. So the public schools become underfunded and then need that gap filled on a local level. But also, the private schools are being kind of overwhelmed with students, and the impact is being seen in students' grades. So again, we saw the voucher programs in Louisiana, Indiana, and Ohio. just as some of the schools, I mean, some of the states, they saw a decrease in student achievement. And one of the two of the aspects that they kind of they've had difficulty projecting for voucher programs is one, they increased state budgets. Because of that gap I'd mentioned, that the public school systems now need filled when those students and that money leaves, they still need funding. So, perfect example in Arizona, they projected that public schools would only need $65 million with this voucher system in place. But by students leaving and going to private schools and leaving that gap, the public school budget actually needed 708 million in Arizona. So in 2023, they essentially had an over $600 million gap in funding. And who does that burden now get passed on to? Taxpayers. In New Hampshire, they projected again in 2021, they projected the cost for public schools budget to be 130,000 and ended up being 14.7 million. So there's a significant gap that is being left up to the states to fulfill. And if you're a state that doesn't have that income laying around, that's very difficult to just find. And when you don't have the federal funding to supplement it, it leaves a lot for schools to make up, for communities to make up, especially. And one of the reasons that gap exists is because the voucher may not cover the private school expenses in general, depending on your neighborhood. Again, because public education is funded based on taxpayer money and property taxes. If you're from a neighborhood where property values may be lower, there's not as much tax revenue for the local government to take in, you then you then bring that voucher to a private school, that private school may be more expensive than your voucher is worth. So then the parent will have to fulfill that gap. So if your voucher for your community is worth $12,000, but your private school tuition for that given year is 16,000, that's a $4,000 gap that's now on the parent. So some parents are also finding themselves not getting the bargain that they believe themselves to be signing up for. Another popular topic in Trump's administration that is absolutely affected by the reduction of Department of Education. This is elimination of the critical race theory. Critical race theory is a framework that examines how race and racism are embedded in laws, policies, and institutions, leading to unequal outcomes for people of color. It argues that racism is not just individual prejudice, but also a systemic problem. So, the entire point of critical race theory is to basically break down how racism has been a social construct that's affected lives, systems, institutions in America. And that's absolutely something that the Department of Education the reduction of the Department of Education is designed to halt. So also what most people don't realize too is critical race theory also has branched off into feminist theory, theories on just not just African American studies, but Mexican American studies and other aspects from the overarching structure of DEI. So it's not just racial issues that are being impacted by this elimination, but it's also our conversations about gender, about identity, and about just people in America. And so far, again, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of checks and balances, a U.S. a U.S. court on the federal level has issued a preliminary order blocking part of the DI ban. So, in terms of the critical race theory, there are some aspects where it gets vague with this administration, and that's kind of what I'll touch on in the next couple of slides. So the Trump administration on January 29th, again through executive order, barred diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, as well as race-based programs from education. So essentially, any program or class that explicitly discusses race, especially in form of its systemic issues, will be challenged by the federal government. So, how is that affecting schools? Schools are now trying to find ways to be creative because, again, it's vague. Now, Linda McMahon, the Secretary of State under Trump, has she hasn't been clear on whether specifically racial affinity clubs or classes like African American history would be under investigation. She's been very gray about that. And for example, racial affinity clubs, those are more so on the college level. For example, at UConn, we had the Rainbow Center, which was for the LGBTQ community. We had PERLAC, which was the Puerto Rican and Latin American Cultural Center. We had the AACC, the African American Cultural Center. So these were spaces that people who identified with these groups could go, could learn, could also receive different resources, whether it's tutoring, free printing, the ability to use Wi Fi and computers for free. Those are some of the programs where we're trying to get more information right now on whether those would be under investigation. But there are 51 schools under investigation for using race as a factor in admissions, scholarships, and others. So the only thing we have like very clear right now is in terms of admissions and scholarships, the Trump administration will investigate you and will sue you for using race as a factor in those. Yale, for example, is a school under investigation right now. They're part of that 51 schools. So schools are being creative. Teachers are starting to teach given topics like African American studies outside of the classroom. They're attempting to go into the community and find spaces where after hours they could teach these courses. Schools are adjusting requirements. They're no longer mandating that gen ed courses that are related to diversity, equity, and inclusion be a part of your mandate in order to achieve your degree. So and the Trump administration is really contending that their position is these classes in a lot of cases can engage in racial stereotyping or create hostile environments. So what they're contending is as long as they don't, as long as some of these spaces like an African American Cultural Center is open to everyone, or some of these classes are being taught in a way that makes everyone feel included, you won't be investigated. But that also draws the contradiction of, some of these classes, when you teach African American studies, you'll have to teach aspects of Jim Crow. You'll have to teach the history of, certain presidents like Thomas Jefferson owning slaves. And so teachers are kind of in limbo in terms of what will actually be something we're punished for. How do we teach this curriculum and this information and do our duty and not leave out information, but also not put ourselves at risk? So, and $600 million in grants for organizations that train teachers on DEI, critical race theory, and social justice activism has been cut. So again, more resources, a lot of money that train teachers and allow new teachers to understand not just what may happen in the past that wasn't covered, but also what's going on right now in present time that's being affected in terms of teachers' education that they can then delineate to their students. And so tariffs and their impact on education. Initially, a lot of people may not think some of these tariffs that are being imposed will see the impact of education. You do expect to see in your daily life, but you'd be surprised how these will actually affect us. So, a tariff is a tax imposed on goods imported from another country, and they're designed to raise the price of the imported goods and potentially to protect domestic industries. So, the line of thinking from the Trump administration is if we impose these tariffs, we will then see people, instead of buying these products from another country, they'll buy these products from America. We also saw that even in the Biden administration, there was a tariff on electric vehicles from China in an attempt to help the domestic electric auto industry succeed. So unfortunately, that's led to added tariffs to products from Canada, Mexico, and China. There's been a 20% tariff on imports from Canada and Mexico, and a 10% tariff on China. So where we see the impact on that in education is though you're not just adding tariffs to products, you're adding tariffs to some of the resources we need to create those products. So where we'll see the impact is there will be an increase on cost of technology. Certain products that teachers use daily have components or wholeheartedly the entire product is being made outside of the country. And to buy those products, we'll now see an increase in cost. So, a perfect example would be projectors, certain laptops or computers, softwares. Those will now cost more money. There would be different electronics that will now see rising costs as well. And for example, to school clothes, we'll see the rising costs in that as well, because some of the materials like polyester that are in our school clothes will be raised in imports as well. So just for those products to be made domestically, they still need some of those materials from outside countries. So in a lot of different ways, we're seeing it be affected on a daily level. And also, again, steel is one of the materials that'll go up in price. So we're going to see an increase in cost of construction for new schools, for renovations of schools, to be able to update schools, whether it be HVAC systems, new rooms. We'll see the increase in those as well. And again, without the Department of Education to provide some of these funds to supplement it, we'll see the localities and state governments really have to take on the burden of that bill and that budget that's being left out. And then finally, in Connecticut, there was a policy for by 2030, Connecticut wants to utilize electric school buses. That way, so obviously the greenhouse emissions that are and the carbon emissions that are being put out through vehicles and large buses, to reduce the pollution in our environment, Connecticut passed legislation that by 2030 it will transition to electric school buses. Again, since this tariff exists on electric vehicles, there will be a rise in cost in electric school buses. And without the Department of Education funds, again, if the state has to cover funds to provide resources to students, they may not have the funds to fund the electric school bus system. So that's something that we kind of schools. I'm located in Georgia as well. They had a similar plan, so everyone's kind of on a wait and see. Let's see what the federal judge's final declaration on this is. We'll finally see how the Department of Education plans to use its funds for the existing positions that are there, and we'll kind of see how we could proceed. So a lot of things are touch and go since we're only less than 2 months into this administration. And immigration is a very important point right now. The Trump administration's position is pursuing the removal of non citizens, whether that be undocumented, green card, or work visa citizens. And they're pressuring states and localities to cooperate with enforcement. So, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, they're utilizing federal funding as kind of an incentive or a punishment to whether you capitulate to what they want. We're seeing that in immigration as well. So fortunately, Connecticut's stance on immigration is it's a sanctuary state. It limits cooperation with federal enforcement efforts and provides benefits to immigrants, including undocumented residents. So Connecticut has a lot of protections and benefits in place for undocumented residents and immigrants in general. Whether you have a green card or work visa, they kind of treat everyone the same, and that's as a citizen. So you could still receive medical care. You can still get a driver's license, get a state identification. You can still receive financial aid for schooling. And every state isn't like that. There are some states that are following suit with the Trump administration and cooperating with ICE officials and other federal officials to make sure they locate immigrants, whether it be undocumented. We're also seeing green card residents, people with work visas be arrested. So Connecticut residents are very fortunate and that Connecticut values its immigrant population and does everything it can to protect them. So the Trust Act was an act passed in Connecticut that restricts state and local law enforcement from cooperating with federal immigration. So essentially, unless you committed a Class A or Class B felony, some of the more severe felonies, usually those felonies are violent crimes. And in Connecticut, Connecticut's not going to give your information to federal law enforcement or authorities. They're not gonna cooperate. Connecticut works on a system of if you guys want to do this, you have to foot the bill and foot the man hours. So whoever you want to look for, you have to spend the money to get your agents here to investigate where that person is, to arrest and detain them. Connecticut wants very little to no part in it. Um, and essentially, they're restricting their state and local law enforcement from helping. So if you do have information, they don't want you to cooperate. They don't want you to just readily give this information over to them. And as I mentioned, Connecticut still allows immigrants to have access to all the in-state benefits. So this affects schools as well. So I'm fortunate to have some friends who are assistant principals in schools throughout Meriden, Hartford. One of my friends is an athletic director in Hartford. So outside of the information I collected and the policies I read, I also went for some firsthand experiences just to kind of understand how are you guys addressing this, and have you seen it? And I've heard quite a bit that they have seen it. Have had to deal with parents who've had concerns with this. So I really got good information on how schools are addressing this and what they do for individual families and students. So schools are training their staff on how to address ICE encounters. So schools are being very strict on who's allowed into the school, who's allowed on school property. They're monitoring who's at the playground because some of these federal authorities and agencies, they may tend to stake out these playgrounds to find a kid or identify kids that may be immigrants or kids that they're under investigation of being in America illegally that they want to detain. So what schools are doing is monitoring their grounds, making sure they understand who's coming in, who's here, who's monitoring who, so they can get a understanding of how they can protect students and to make sure those people are off school grounds. There, for example, one of my friends that I was speaking to, who's an assistant principal in Meriden School District, he said they're using IDs and background checks to verify identity. So you have to come when you come to the school, you have to swipe your ID, and they have a system that in seconds to just few minutes will give a background check and actually detail who this person is, if they have any crimes against them, who they may work for, just so, again, so they can understand who's coming in. Because the important part, especially with Connecticut being a sanctuary state, is ICE officials or anyone who wants to detain an immigrant needs a warrant. You can't just walk into a school or walk up on a school playground and say, hey, this kid is in violation, we want to arrest them. They actually need to present a warrant that's been signed by a judge. And schools are only allowing assistant superintendents, school district attorneys, in very few cases, principals, but mainly administrative level faculty to be the ones to review and evaluate the warrant to make sure it's actually a legal, law binding warrant, and to then allow ICE officials or federal agents to enter the school and detain a student or do what they came to do. If they don't have this warrant, they can't enter. If the warrant looks fraudulent in any way, they won't be allowed in. And also, excuse me. And also, if if the assistant superintendent, whoever, school district attorney, whoever is the person to verify this warrant, if they aren't on school premises, they won't be verifying it. They'll then have to wait until they come in, and the ICE agent or federal official will have to wait outside until they then get permission to come in. So this is just schools' ways to protect children, but also to, in some cases, to provide time, provide time for children and families to kind of understand, hey, this is who's here. If there's a way we could protect this student until we can verify this warrant, what does that look like? So Connecticut is really doing a lot, and schools on a local level are doing a lot to make sure their student population is protected. And how everyone can be proactive. So the first I would recommend is, just get to know your local officials. Hartford, Connecticut, every second and fourth Monday of the month at 7 p.m. has city council meetings. And in those council meetings, you can They go over all of the official business for the city that's taking place. Most kind of important, again, to this topic would be what's going on with schools, what's going on with the funding, what's going on with children and resources for children. And that's a time to be an advocate for your child or children in your community. That's a time where you can voice your concerns. You can understand what's actually going on locally as well. So if there's council members or city officials or mayors who aren't doing what they were elected to do and aren't representing the community's interests, that'll be your time to not only voice your grievances, but understand what they're doing. So when election time comes around, we can hold them accountable. Um, Stay in school with school resources and stay in the know with school resources and counselors. School counselors and social workers have a wealth of information, and I created a list of some of the links I could share after the meeting of just resources, nonprofits who are there to help students and their families. So whether that may be resources to help new residents, whether you are new to Connecticut or new to America through Connecticut, there's nonprofits who will help you and aid you with that transition. If you are going through legal proceedings in order to become a citizen, there are nonprofits who will provide attorneys and pay attorney fees so that you can go through that legal pathway and attain citizenship. So just keeping an open line of communication. One thing some of the people I talked to who worked in Connecticut schools mentioned is don't be afraid to call them. Don't be afraid to reach out to your school, to speak to administrators, to speak to teachers, so they can put you in contact with people who can help. Because schools want to help, a lot of times people don't know. And there's actually been a reduction in students, not just in Connecticut, but throughout the country, who have been who in anticipation of Trump's policies have either reverted to homeschooling to avoid their kids being identified by ICE, or they've went back to actually their country of origin to avoid being deported and potentially even their family being separated. So, you know, that's extremely unfortunate. And if you keep in contact with your school resources and counselors, there could be some methods to subvert that so families won't have to go through those unfortunate separations and extensive circumstances. And sources that I use just to keep updated, whether it be locally or nationally, are the Hartford Current, NPR, The Intercept. Those are just some resources I wanted to share because in this climate, there are certain publications. Again, as I mentioned, I part of my education was understanding propaganda in the media. So unfortunately, there are some publications who are upheld as extremely reputable who don't actually delineate the best information. So if you want to get unbiased information, kind of understand what actually is happening, so you're best informed, these are some of the publications who do it well and do it as unbiased as they can. And that is the end of our presentation. So if there's any questions or any clarification anyone needs, just let me know. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Mr. Brown?
Yeah, yeah, I can hear you now.
All right, yeah, that was amazing. I just wanted to say thank you. That presentation was awesome and very wealthy in knowledge. I'm gonna pass the questions to someone else because I don't want to hog all the questions. But I just have one question for you. And it would be, what do you think the purpose for some of the erasure is of like critical race theory and just the cultural history that we have in this country? Like, why do you think it's being erased?
I think a lot of the reason it's being erased is so certain structures, and again, because critical race theory deals with systemic issues, a lot of the structures of America they don't want called into question. They don't want evaluation of the history of America and some of the groups, whether it be racial groups, but even just classes groups. Because we also have to remember Donald Trump is a wealthy man. The people who are in his cabinet are wealthy people. His Secretary of Education, Linda McMahon, is a wealthy person. These are billionaires or one percenters. And a lot of it is they don't want the demographics and the groups that they are a part of to be held under fire, to understand how you've impacted America, how you've impacted these communities and localities, and how legislation has impacted and affected the people. So that's a big reason why they don't want the education passed on, is because if you're less informed about how it's happened in the past, it'll be more difficult for you to discern how it's happening to you currently. And as it happens, again, as I mentioned, some of these publications are touting it as good things. You may think it's good. You know what I mean? You may think some of these things are beneficial and help you if you don't understand in the past what it looked like and the actual drawbacks of similar legislation being passed, or similar education being had. So again, perfect example for critical race theory. If we're not understanding or evaluating systemic racism, when those institutions practice systemic racism, we won't understand what it fully looks like.
Thank you. And to anyone that has any questions, we have 7 more minutes. So just to give everyone a heads up. And Q, can you just unshare your screen so we could just see you
Oh,
on the
sure.
spotlight, please? Thank
Yeah, sorry about that.
you. All right. Does anyone have any questions?
It could be anything at all.
Thank you. That was very helpful and resourceful. Will the information that you shared with us today, uh, the your slides and your references to appropriate where you get fact checking information and any other kind of resources, will that be available that we could share when we put this when we share the 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 webinar that you did today. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I'll export them all in a PDF, and yeah, I'll definitely distribute that. And I believe I have everyone's email. I know I at least have Trey and Miss Snell's email, so I'll put that in the email and disperse it for everyone.
Thank you.
Absolutely. And if any other information pops up after, or any questions you all may have, feel free, and I can answer those or provide links for those as well in the email.
All right. Doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I just want to. Oh, you have a question, Yatina? Oh no. Okay. Oh, you
Mhm.
clapping. So I just want to say thank you again, LaQuentes, and we look forward to just hearing more about, what you do, and hopefully we get to see you on TV one day doing this as well. So thank you very much. I appreciate it, and I'm going to stop recording.
Absolutely. Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.